Welcome back, Biology of Cells and Tissues. Jumping right into the microanatomy of the heart. Again, if you can, leave a like on the video. Subscribe if you aren't already. Really helps out. And here we go. So, when we talk about the microanatomy of the heart, we're going to kind of dive into the different layers of the tissue of the heart. So there's three, technically four, layers that we're going to talk about. Three specifically of like the actual heart itself, and then also like an extra coating around the heart that's a protective coating. So the three layers that we're going to talk about are the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. And then the pericardium is that outer layer. Again, just a little reminder, it's super important when we talk about science courses that we start to understand the lingo, start to understand the words, specifically the roots of the words. So epi is outer, myo means muscle, endo is inner, cardium, we're talking about cardiac or the heart itself. We can also add peri in here as well. So peri is surrounding. Most often it's used in the context of like surrounding fascicles. Like we talk about muscle tissue, nerve tissue, they're the bundles of the fibers, and those are called fascicles. But peri really is just kind of around. It means like it's an around layer. Okay, so starting with the pericardium, this is not gone into in depth specifically in the cells and tissues course at the school, but I think it's very important to look at this now because we start to use the word of pericardium and talking about pericardium, and we need to know what it actually is. So the pericardium is a double-walled sac that encapsulates the heart. It provides protection and anchors the heart in place within the thoracic cavity. That's its big job. So it's made up of two different layers. There's the fibrous pericardium, which is the outer layer. That's the tough, inelastic, and it really is what protects the heart and anchors it to everything. The next layer, the deeper layer, is the serous pericardium. Okay, it's a slippery membrane that actually secretes lubricating fluid. And it's divided into two sublayers, being the parietal layer and the visceral layer. So the parietal layer is just on the inner surface of the fibrous pericardium. The visceral layer is the epicardium, which we're going to talk about after this. So the visceral layer is the inner layer of the serous pericardium. So it's the inner layer of it, lies directly on the heart surface, also known as the epicardium, and forms part of the heart wall. So let's look at this really quick right here. Outermost layer is the fibrous pericardium, and then we have this right here, this parietal layer of serous pericardium. We have this space. This is, well, it's going to get really confusing in some of your courses. They're going to talk about these quote-unquote cavities or these spaces. They'll talk about the pericardial cavity or space. This is a potential space, okay? You're also going to see this when you talk about lung tissue and a couple of our other tissues that move consistently. The reason why we have this layer, they call it a slippery membrane that secretes lubricating fluid. The reason why we have this lubricating fluid is to fight friction. Friction, as we know, rub our hands together. One, it creates resistance, and then it creates heat. We don't want our heart to overheat because it's constantly beating. So having this layer of fluid, this lubricating fluid, it reduces and almost eliminates all of the friction, so heat isn't produced. And we have this little space, or this potential space, because in reality, these layers are so close together that essentially the epicardium, or that visceral layer, is slapped right up against the parietal layer. It's almost like, think of your two fingers of the layer, put a drop of oil in between them, and then squeeze your fingers together and rub them. That's essentially what these layers are. It's two layers. They're literally touching, just that there's that little layer of fluid in between them. Okay? We call it a potential space because in cases of pathology, it does become more of an actual space or a cavity, okay? Like there's a condition called pericarditis. Pericarditis is inflammation of that space, and you can get a buildup of fluid or of blood or of other things in that space that actually then separates those two layers, and that's a big issue, okay? I don't want you to focus too much on this. I wanted to go over that briefly because it's going to come back in future courses when we dive into pathology. Right now, you just need to know that pericardium, surrounds it. You have the fibrous layer, you have a parietal layer, you have then the visceral layer, and then there's a little bit of oily fluid in between the parietal and the visceral layer. Okay? That's as far as we need to go with all of this. And again, noting that that visceral layer is also the epicardium. So the epicardium kind of double dips. It's part of the pericardium, but it's also part of the heart wall. Okay? So talking about the epicardium itself, the epicardium is the outermost layer of the heart itself. It's also known as that serous or that visceral layer of the pericardium. The epicardium, this is where like AKAs get a little bit blech. The epicardium is made up of a single layer of mesothelial cells. And so it is called the mesothelium. So kind of this sentence right here. So the epicardium is made up of a single layer of mesothelial cells, which is called the mesothelium. So it gets a little bit confusing where, again, you kind of throw in AKAs there. You can basically say the epicardium is the serous or visceral layer of the pericardium. You can also say that the epicardium is mesothelium, or you can say that the epicardium is a single layer of mesothelial cells. Okay? It's almost just like stacking a bunch of AKAs on top of each other. So if you hear any variation like that, they're talking about the epicardium. Within the epicardium, there's also, so we're not going to go too deep into it, but there's also kind of like extra little layers of the epicardium inside, because there's also a loose connective tissue with veins, nerves, and ganglia. Remember we talked about ganglia before, as well as some adipose tissue we say is there as well. So right in here, I guess I should clarify what I'm saying specifically. The epicardium includes, let me do... Epicardium is technically also layered. Mesothelium, loose connective tissue, and then adipose. So I'm going to clarify a little bit more what I said. Technically, you can separate these as different layers. We mostly associate epicardium with mesothelium because, again, the other chunks of it can be either thicker or thinner, depending where you look. So mostly mesothelium with epicardium. But then we also have a very thin connective tissue layer in between, where you have those nerves and other things. And then you have adipose tissue. So where this block right here, this is our epicardium. So better, it is lined by a single layer of mesothelial cells. Bam, bam, bam. Okay. another picture of epicardium. These are the pictures that were, this picture I pulled off online to see it a little bit better. This is one of the pictures that was already here in this PowerPoint, so this is more likely going to be the kind of picture you're going to see that you are tested on. Big clue to look at is find the myocardium, which we're about to talk about. The myocardium is this muscle tissue. It's much denser. It's got all the muscle cells. And so you can see the epicardium is the outer layer of the muscular layer. And all these lipid droplets here, those are all of our adipose tissue. Adipose, lipids, fats, that kind of stuff. Myocardium and endocardium are a little bit simpler than the pericardium and the epicardium. Essentially, the myocardium, myo is muscle. It's literally just a thick chunk of muscle. That's all it is. It's the thickest layer. It's big. It's muscular. Bam. All of that is myocardium. We touched a little bit about muscle cells in the muscle lecture. So cardiac muscle cells have a little bit different qualities. I don't want to get too deep into this because, again, this is going to be a lot of physiology 1. But cardiac muscles, like skeletal muscles, they are striated. Striated means that they have sarcomeres, so they contract and move, kind of that sliding filament theory, just like skeletal muscle does. And they're kind of like, you can almost see like there's this branched or this Y shape. They call it a branched shape. So you can see right here, these are our intercalated discs is what they're called. And you have gap junctions between those. I think way back we talked a little bit about gap junctions. Gap junctions are in between those. And then they're connected these intercalated discs. And they're kind of this Y-ish shaped. I don't want to go too deep into that now because, again, you're going to go way deeper in physiology about that. Finally, the endocardium. Endocardium, again, has multiple layers. So we're going to go superficial to the deepest layer. We have the subendocardial layer. It's the outermost layer. This is where we have loose connective tissue, we have nerves, and we have Purkinje fibers. We mentioned Purkinje fibers before when we were talking about the autorhythmic, or those pacemaker cells, those specialized cardiac muscle cells. The Purkinje fibers, these are specialized conductive fibers that are responsible for transmitting electrical impulses throughout the ventricles. Okay, so subendocardial layer contains all of those guys. There is a middle connective tissue layer made up of collagen elastic fibers. We don't usually talk a lot about this middle layer, just that it's there. So this specific professor, whose stuff I based all of this on, did not have this included as a layer, but it is there. Next, we have the subendothelium layer. It's made up of loose connective tissue. It's the cushion supportive scaffolding for the endothelial layer. And then the deepest part is the endothelial layer, which is made up of a single layer of endothelial cells. It is a simple squamous epithelium. Or think back to our epithelium lecture. What does that mean? Simple. Simple meaning a single layer. Squamous. Squamous being the flattened, more the flattened disc shaped. And then epithelial cells. And these line the interior surface of the heart chambers and then covers the heart valves. Again, I'm going to throw in a little clinical tidbit here just so you start hearing some of these words. This is not going to be part of your tested material, but there's a condition called endocarditis. Endocarditis. That is inflammation of the endothelial layer. A lot of times connected to some type of other infection, like a streptococcus, strep throat, a strep infection. Want to start making this connection now. This is going to come up in the future. If somebody has strep throat or a condition called rheumatic fever, these can be associated with endocarditis, inflammation of the endothelial layer. Just, again, none of that, what I just said, is testable, but it's just something, so you start to hear these words and start to get them, when you get to them eventually in the future, you can stop and think, oh, hey, I recognize that word. What's that from? That's from way back here in the heart lecture. Okay, so here we have these different layers. You can see right here, there's our myocardial muscle fiber layers. Here we have some Purkinje fibers running through there. There's the subendocardium, and then, of course, the endothelium right there. Like I said, don't pay a lot of attention to the middle connective layer. We need the subendocardial, subendothelium, and endothelial layers. The subendothelial layer would be more like right in here. Again, we don't talk about it until with those Purkinje fibers. So we don't talk about it a ton. There's the myocardium and the endocardium. You can see all the different layers again. And again, so that overall, that is the heart in general. I think what I'm going to do, just for making this nice and organized, I'm going to go ahead and stop this, make this a part 2, make it a little bit shorter, and then in our part 3, we're just going to lock in and focus on blood vessels. So thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful day and good luck studying.